Welcome. Welcome to our participants from across Canada and from several countries around the world. My name is Randy Williamson. I'm a partner in Aird Berlis' Corporate Commercial Group and leader of our group's Innovation Committee. With me today is Aaron Baer, one of my corporate commercial colleagues. Aaron's also a member of our practice group's Innovation Committee and of the firm's Technology Committee, as well as editor of the popular Legal Tech blog. Also with us today, Aaron.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you. Also with us today is Melissa LaFlair.
Good morning.
Melissa is a lawyer with over 20 years of experience both in private practice and in industry. And for the last 7.5 years, she has been the leader at LaFlair Legal and Project Management Services. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you.
I'm glad our attendees today are from nearly every province in Canada and from several countries around the globe. Unlike many of the webinars our firm offers on substantive legal matters, legal service innovation knows no jurisdiction. The solutions that can be developed and employed can work in Toronto. As well, they can work as easily in Nova Scotia, British Columbia, the United States, or anywhere in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, or Australia. I'm going to start by asking Melissa and Aaron if you have some opening observations around legal innovation and what you think we may talk about today.
I think that legal innovation is really a necessity and it's a response to a mature legal market. So we're in the midst of what I call the technical revolution, which is like the Industrial Revolution. It's not changes that happen by the flick of a light switch. It's evolving over time. And we're in a buyer's market and there's a lot of competition in a mature market. And so innovation is a necessity and a way of responding to changing market dynamics.
Great,
I think there are going to be people that will say, I've heard this before. People have been predicting this change for 20 years. And that may be true in some cases, but this time actually is different, and we'll talk about why. I also think, we look at a lot of the threats sometimes, and people focus on, there's the threat from this and threat from this. But what they sometimes forget about are all these opportunities that are out there for a firm or a lawyer or anyone who's entrepreneurial and enterprising to gain an advantage and potentially actually end up in a better position than they were in before. So we'll talk about all these things.
Great. Well, as you said, this is an evolution, and there's a lot going on. What we're hoping to do today is not just talk specifically about technology solutions, although they have application, but instead with our audience try and share some observations about what we think is happening currently, what we think may be coming soon, and what we think is likely coming, but perhaps a little further along. As you can see from the slide, we're hoping to talk a little bit about what clients are thinking, as well what some of the competition looks like, a bit about what some of the strategies and managers of legal service providers, we'll often talk about them as LSPs today, some operational opportunities, and then we will also, of course, touch on some processes and technology. I do want to invite our audience today to pose any questions. We received a few before we started this morning, but as well, there is a box on your screen where you can pose some questions, and we'll do our best towards the end of the session to answer as many of them as we can. Of course, at the bottom of this slide, you'll see I'd be remiss if we left you with the impression that Aaron and my firm, or our clients, or any of Melissa's clients, were doing everything that we might touch on today. Because as it says, we're all on this ongoing journey, and we don't know when we'll get to a destination, if ever. So just wanted to highlight that for everybody. So starting talking a little bit about clients. Melissa, one of the things I noticed just in the last week is I received a copy of a study that Thomson Hein in the U.S. Did, surveying over 200 legal and other executives at more than 175 companies. And one of the things that was maybe not surprising in the study is that more than 50% of the respondents said that they were seeing none or hardly any innovation from their law firms. And that, in fact, over 70% couldn't cite a single example of significant change in the last 3 years. About half of them said that they thought they were partly at fault for this. Because they weren't demanding more from their law firms, and that in fact half of them said that they were also changing how they were working internally. What do you think is going on here?
I think there are a couple of things. I think one is that a lot of companies, and particularly the corporate side of the relationship that I deal with, they're getting their own house in order first. So they don't want to make demands without understanding what the implications of those demands are and without knowing that they have their internal shops in order. I think also, it's a relationship, and relationships take work, and I don't think that the communication on client expectations and experiences is as strong as it should be for effective client-firm relationships. And opening those lines of communication and having it be non-transactional, so a lot of the interaction right now between clients and their firms is on a product basis and an outcome basis, not a relationship basis. And there aren't really effective means, and that's something I'm personally working on with my organization, of fostering productive discussions about what the actual needs are. And so getting out of a reactionary firefighting mode, meeting the deliverable, and looking more holistically at the relationship and the needs on both sides of the relationship is where things have to go in order to see really effective change.
That's great. And so, what are some of the things that you're seeing them doing specifically in dealing with their legal service providers, their LSPs?
I'm literally in the process of helping an organization roll out billing guidelines with their external providers, and it's also helping get the data organized internally so that they understand where fixed fee arrangements are appropriate or aren't appropriate, and being able to work with their firms to outline what is of high value to them and what isn't, and find a way of right-sizing the effort and getting value for the money that's being spent.
And what happens if they come up against some kind of resistance from their service providers?
Well, they do. There's varying degrees, and I can say from my time as a general counsel, I went through exactly all of this on behalf of the company that I was GC for. The expectation is not that you achieve perfection when you make a request. The expectation is that there is effort on the other side to meet those expectations and help you work together to find a solution. And frankly, firms that aren't willing and lawyers that aren't willing to put in that effort and make the necessary changes get fired. And, in a firm environment, unlike accountants, where if you're the auditor and you have to actually say whether you're changing auditors and it's on the record, firms often don't know that they've been fired. That someone just moves their business somewhere else, and they keep the relationship going because there's usually something that's happened, some deal, some transaction. They might need to go back and get advice on that, so they don't want a bad relationship there, but they just take future business somewhere else.
And how do you think law firms are responding to this?
I think a lot of them don't know they've been fired. So, and they, look at the shorter term, whether they still have billings and business and people busy, and they don't necessarily realize until it's been a long time since they've heard from a client, and they wonder why, and then it's sort of after the fact.
So if as was stated in the Thompson-Hines study, the clients aren't demanding enough of their law firms, and they start doing so, how might the law firms respond to that? Like if the demand is placed on a law firm by their clients saying, hey, we need to figure this out, what are some of the first things that the law firms can do?
Understand why the client has that need. So what's the business driver? What is it? Is that there's a resource constraint on the client? Is there a new evolving business? Like what are the drivers? And how can the firm match its resources and its capabilities with the client's needs?
And so then where do they take that? Once they've sort of figured some of that out, where might they take that? What are some of the approaches they can take?
Well, then you look at your own business and look at the data, look at your resources, look at are there fixed fee types of offerings that you can give to your clients? Are there budgets that you can give? Because sometimes it's just a matter of visibility and certainty. The actual end number isn't necessarily a number that the client doesn't like. It's that it's always an unknown and a surprise. And you've got a CFO somewhere saying, what's the number I put in the spreadsheet? And a GC saying, I don't know. And so, sometimes it's not a dramatic change in the final outcome or product. It's just how you get there.
So one of the things, when you talked about those things, one of the things we hear a lot about lately is legal project management, or LPM. How's that going?
Well, that's LPM. From my perspective, is people understanding the process that's part of their product. So, understanding as an organization, particularly as a law firm, if we work on deals, what part of the work we do is repetitive, what part of it's routine, what part of it's unique, and technology and innovation is really helpful for dealing with the more repetitive and routine elements of the work to leave the value-added analysis that the lawyers are doing to the lawyers. A great example is if you have a junior sitting in a boardroom with boxes and boxes of leases, and it used to be in my time a dictaphone, and going through to find the change of control provisions, the value add of that review and the learning for the student probably ended on box 1. And, that's where machine learning can really help and take over. And you still need lawyers to review and assess the output, but they don't need to do the heavy lifting.
Right. One of the things that I wonder about, and are starting to hear a little bit about, is as legal project management starts becoming more ingrained or used or embedded in the process between law firms and their clients, is that we can move towards a more true outsourcing type model. And when I think of an outsourcing model, I think, as has happened in many other industries, where the customer and the supplier, or in our case the legal service provider and the client, are able to design the processes together. This morning, or in the last couple of days, I received a report about one of the good leading U.S. law firms that had won a Association of Corporate Counsel Award for being a 2018 Value Champion. And any of our participants here today could find this easily online. Seafarth Shaw, who many of you may be familiar with, has a nice description of an arrangement that they've come to with 7-Eleven in the last few months, where 7-Eleven was really looking to find a way to reduce their spend and, in fact, bring some uniformity. And Seafarth Shaw really sat down, not just with their instructing principals at 7-Eleven, but with the business leaders as well at 7-Eleven, to really figure out how do we both insource and outsource the right kinds of work? How do we concentrate some of the repetitive tasks, perhaps, in one of our offices so that 7-Eleven and its business leaders know exactly who to go to for certain things? And how do we then leave them perhaps more sophisticated, maybe more subtle advisory services in the appropriate other places, so that they could actually generate a significant reduced spend? And in the case of 7-Eleven, they were talking about over 10,000 properties. So figuring out a way to work both internally and externally was much broader than a LPM initiative, as it appeared to me as I read about it.
Well, that's a great example of focusing on the needs of the client in the business context, and taking a leap of faith, frankly, as a firm, because some firms will look at this and say, oh, we're going to reduce our spend. They're reducing our spend, and now we're going to be vulnerable. Instead, it's like, now we've developed a product and a process that's going to attract more clients.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, because when I was reading about what the criteria was for getting an ACC, Association of Corporate Counsel Value Champion Award, it's got to be a process that's replicable. And so I would suspect that Seafarth Shaw, whether they were innovating, for the first time in this way with 7-Eleven or taking some of their prior learnings, have certainly felt that they've got a product that they can probably sell to some other clients. Very good. All right, we're going to move a little bit from that, and I think it's perhaps a good segue to talk a little bit about what are some of the competitive pressures that our legal service providers are seeing. And you'll, as I said earlier, you'll hear us say throughout this, we'll refer to law firms occasionally, we'll refer to business service providers occasionally, including alternative legal service providers, but occasionally we'll also call all of them LSPs. So within the traditional law firm framework and perhaps an in-house counsel department, we're seeing some changes, which are positive. And I wonder what you might be able to share about those changes that you're seeing specifically.
Well, I'm seeing, sort of to continue on the analysis of the business case, in-house departments figuring out where the best value is for the delivery of the services that are required. And the 7-Eleven example is a great example of that. Sometimes it's in the firm, and sometimes it's in the company. And the competition is also from, non-traditional legal service providers, and in-house departments themselves can decide. And there's an ongoing cost-benefit analysis that's being done for people to decide where the resources are best used and where the best value is based on the existing resources, because there's usually more than enough work to be done, particularly in an in-house setting, and it's figuring out how to get that work done with the available budget.
And so certainly one of the things we've been observing is that law firms are responding.
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the C. Shaw case, they decided to create this center of excellence, if you will, for certain elements of what they needed to do for their clients. We're also seeing, of course, law firms in Canada and around the world that are deciding to find a place where they can either offshore or nearshore some of these more repetitive types of legal service offerings. In fact, we're also seeing, I think, law firms understanding that they don't necessarily have to have all of the legal service capabilities internally, and they're hiring some outside legal service professionals to assist them. Clearly, we're seeing, as you mentioned earlier, Melissa, some pricing alternatives being adopted. I mean, it was probably one of the first things the law firms were trying to do to respond to their clients' needs on certainty. As well, maybe a little less comfortable, but is really assessing processes and how they approach that. And then, of course, the result of that sometimes can be the adoption of appropriate technologies. And so I think that, in fact, and in some markets around the world, not here in North America yet, but you're even seeing some traditional law firms that are finding ways of accessing outside capital. There's at least a couple of jurisdictions where outside capital is permitted, whether by public offering or otherwise, and that, of course, can sometimes, with capital, you can accelerate some of these improvements. But one of the other things we're also seeing, frankly, quite a lot of now, is what I've termed the professional business service provider. That also includes what I might refer to as alternate legal services providers. And for our audience, when we're thinking about that, the professional service providers can mean all manner of other types of consulting firms. And the ones we're going to talk about a little bit today, because I think there's been a fair bit written about this, certainly in the last few months or couple of years, is around the Big Four international accounting firms. And when we talk about alternate legal service providers, there's been an advent in the last decade of a large number of companies that have evolved that are providing outsourced legal services. Companies like United Lex and Axiom are two that come to mind. A couple of observations about these professional service providers, and speaking about the accounting firms for a minute, there was a UK study that I read recently that suggested that just the Big Four accounting firms, so we're just talking about PwC and KPMG and Deloitte and Ernst & Young, that the study felt that they were thinking that those four companies alone could target about $30 billion in US dollars in revenue in the coming decade. That in fact 2/3 of law firm leaders in one survey see those Big Four, leave aside every other form of consultant or alternate legal provider, as a significant threat. I specifically noted that from very low consulting revenues after 2000's tech meltdown, those four firms alone now comprise over $70 billion, again US dollars, in consulting revenues. And then as an observation here in our country, in Canada, I noted that a year or two ago, Deloitte Canada's own leader said in 2016 that within 2 years they wanted 30% of their revenues, and in 2016 Deloitte had $2 billion in revenue, so call it $600 million of revenues, to come from new services that they were not then providing. And so when we think about professional business services and consulting services, certainly legal services fall within that realm. And so I think that having observed the accounting firms, or the historically viewed accounting firms, over the 35 years since I actually got my CPA, the evolution of those firms to being able to provide professional business services has been quite dramatic. And there's a few reasons for that, and we've listed a couple of here, but certainly they have gotten quite adept at figuring out how to develop and execute well-valued and effectively priced professional business services. Aaron, have you got a thought there?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting also is, if you've been in the legal industry for a while, you've seen business done a certain way. You've been trained a certain way in law school, and you've had certain thought processes. And often that's going to not only affect your view, but also you're often trying to move away from the status quo. You're taking an initial position of a way of doing something and then deviating away from it. It's the same with the law school. It traditionally teaches in a certain way. They want to start being a little bit more innovative, but it's generally not a starting from scratch model. It's, let's add a course on this, or we'll add a little bit here. It's a lot different when you don't have an existing business and you're looking and saying, here's this massive market. What role do we want to play? What do our clients want, and how are we going to attack it? And that allows, that's a threat, I think, to a lot of existing law firms, because you've got a lot of entrenched values or at big companies, and here you're able to say, look, what's the best thing to do, and let's do that, and let's use the best processes, technologies, and other things that we have and we've built up in other spaces, and try to apply that here. So I think different challenges, definitely, depending on if you're an incumbent versus a new entrant into the space, for sure.
And we've seen it in many other industries, of course, where the person with no baggage can think about how to deliver a product or service in a completely different manner. I think one of the aspects as well for those large accounting firms, or historically viewed accounting firms, consulting firms, is that over their evolution of their own services, they really have developed some internationalized, well-capitalized product development capabilities. And I think that as they look at legal services, they're coming at it with that kind of mindset. And I think as well, one of my observations over the last several years, or probably over the last decade in particular, is that they've moved away from thinking about what are their services and who may they sell them to thinking who do they wish their clients to be and which services will they offer them. And that if they don't have those services already, that they will buy them or develop them. And we see it regularly when we see the big four accounting firms and others actually going out and buying companies. I mean, the capitalization of these international consulting firms is quite dramatic. And then I think the other element as well, or another element regarding the alternate service providers, like Axiom and United Lex, is, and I think this goes, Melissa, a little bit to your comment before about internal law departments thinking about how to work with their external service providers. These organizations as well are also very well capitalized, and in many respects can afford to virtually buy the internal work from large corporations. For example, United Lex in the last year has done two very large deals, essentially buying the legal departments of both, portions of the legal departments of both General Electric and a large technology provider in the U.S., DHX. And they've essentially either been able to commit to writing a check to do so, or to commit to a pricing model that has the equivalency of writing a check. And that the mindset there is that over the course of a multi-year contract, a long-term contract, that they can improve the delivery model and the results, that in fact there's a focus on defining results with those clients and measuring those results so that they can be assured that they can show the delivery of those results. And that on that basis, if there are large companies thinking about how to externalize some of their legal spend, that it may leave some of the traditional law firms out because they don't have the capitalization to be able to define their product as well, or actually write a check, or virtually write a check. And I think, Melissa, you may have some comment on this, but the concept of using your traditional law firm for things regularly is becoming less regular. That in fact expertise, price, scale, and as I said a minute ago, results are in some ways replacing the historical brand or reputation of a traditional law firm in terms of a company deciding or a client deciding how to choose its service provider.
Well, I think it goes back to the cost-benefit analysis that a client undertakes when they look at the work that they have, their projected work and needs, and how it aligns with their internal business. So they first have to get alignment internally with what the legal department is going to do to support the success of the strategy of the organization, and then figure out, is it best served internally or externally? And if coming up with a fixed fee model or some sort of arrangement that makes economic sense to the client with the firm isn't possible, and they have the resources, they'll do it internally. There is no silver bullet here for anybody, for anything. It literally is a case by case, and it's a matter of matching up. As a firm, do you have a group of clients with similar needs that you can create a product to address? And as a corporation, have you found a provider that can meet the specific needs? Because every company is different. They're all on different trajectories. They all have different resources and different constraints and needs. And it's about understanding the business need that's being supported by legal and where the best resources are for supporting that. And so if a firm is unable to do it, there are other third-party providers. There's offshoring, there's outsourcing to other organizations. There's a lot of flexibility, and the whole point now is that there isn't an answer. It's about figuring out and anticipating what needs are rather than being reactionary.
Right. Well, and as they're looking at those needs, there are also this other category that we've termed the disruptive technology developers, the disruptive competitors, if you will. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technology in particular in a few minutes, Aaron, but I wonder if you could share with us just sort of your observations on why they're playing in this space.
So, I think you're seeing a lot of new products and new technologies out there, and people often say, as I alluded to at the start, well, what's different this time? And with a lot of the technology, it's a couple things. It's, the processing power of computers, the availability of data, and just the ability to do things with algorithms and other things like that, that you can apply these things on a much larger scale and much more affordably that would just simply not have been possible in the past. And you're able to look and say, as Randy also alluded to at the start, this may not just be a Toronto solution. This may be a solution that can be applied in multiple places, which allows me to build a much different product than if I'm just trying to reach a smaller market. I think we've seen firms take very different approaches, and it's also going to depend on who their clients are. If you're servicing large corporations versus you're servicing individuals, it's going to be a very different ballgame depending on the sophistication and the budgets of your clients. But I think some firms are forming partnerships. They're investing in some of these companies. They're opening up incubators. Others are using the technology. Some are taking a wait-and-see approach. And just because a firm is using the technology, how well is it actually being used? How well has it been applied, and how well has it been embraced? And I think it's a challenge for a lot of firms, as historically technology hasn't really been geared towards lawyers. It's been there to support the back office kind of tasks, like you think of word processing or basic things like that. And this is a little bit different because it's really affecting the actual process of the way that legal work gets done, and that's different.
Well, and the other thing, much like the professional business service providers, a lot of the disruptive developers are also well capitalized. And then, much like we see in any other technology venture realm, there will be a lot of failure. And in fact, the investors in this area are quite prepared for that. That in fact, although most will fail, many of these technologies that are being developed, the few that survive will thrive and will have significant impact, or could have significant impact, on the way in which clients and legal service providers deliver the product and service.
Absolutely, and I think a few years ago, it was a lot more challenging for a legal tech company to get funding, and I think they were commanding lower valuations in many cases than other tech companies. They are probably still commanding lower valuations, but certainly there's been a massive increase in funding and in acquisitions of these companies already, and it's just getting going. This is a pretty nascent industry, so I think we expect to see a lot more funding in that space, and therefore a lot more ways that these companies can offer interesting products and solutions to law firms and to all other people that need legal services.
Well, and I think, Aaron, one of the things you and I spend a reasonable amount talking about is that in many respects, these three categories of competition can work together. We're seeing regularly where professional service providers are teaming up with technology providers. We're seeing law firms team up with technology providers. In fact, Aaron and I were chatting a few days ago about one we saw in Switzerland recently, where in fact you had all three of these categories working closely together. One of the largest national law firms in Switzerland, together with PwC and a technology developer, to create a contract builder software that required the user not to contact with any one of those three organizations, that they could access it online and build their own product. So I think that we all have to be aware of how to work together with these competitors, and that maybe our traditional view of competition being other law firms in our city has got to change quite dramatically.
I think one last thought, I guess, before we move on here is, we've seen a lot more work going in-house, and that's presumably a reaction to the fact that companies don't feel they're getting the value they need right now. And so, if you keep on doing things the way you've always done them, you're not changing the value proposition you offer. And so, again, you can look at some of these as competitors, as you should, but there are also opportunities where you say, they may have something that we can't either offer internally or a skill set we don't have, and there's a way for us to combine with them and be able to go back to the client and say, look, our value proposition has changed. And
so I want to hold one thought that you raised, Aaron. We'll hold it for a couple of slides about when we talk about technology, not just the way the legal service providers are using it, but perhaps, Melissa, you and Aaron could also talk when we get to it about the way clients themselves are adopting the technologies. But we're going to move on here. Again, if you have a decent understanding of what your clients are looking for, and you have a relative knowledge of what your competition might look like, now as a legal service provider, you can be thinking about, well, how do we respond? And we've touched on a few of those points. Obviously, one of the biggest concerns for clients for a very long time has been the uncertainty of cost. And that uncertainty of cost, I think, has got some historical narrative around it, in that where legal service providers, the traditional law firms especially, we're able to work on a retainer or an hourly fee type basis, and that's worked for decades, if not longer.
I think it was originally something that clients wanted. The hourly fee was what clients wanted, and obviously it creates certain incentives, and now there's, of course, a shift happening.
Exactly. And in fact, there's an interesting University of Michigan study you could look for that talks a little bit about the history of how clients and law firms work together. But of course, we've heard for a long time that the hourly fee approach was going to go the way of the dodo bird, and here we are 30, 40, 50 years later, and it hasn't happened. And I think it's fair to say that it hasn't happened in part because it still works. It still works in many circumstances. I often think about our practice here at the firm and the way law firms work generally, and there's a substantial amount of what we do that is pure advice. And Melissa, you talked earlier about there's always going to be the need for lawyers to continue to give advice around things, and that occasionally discrete advisory services, they still may fit the hourly service model or a project basis or a per diem amount or something like that. But then also over that same several decade time frame, as regulations and lawsuits and deals and the like, real estate developments, etc., all have become more complex. The role of the legal service provider has often become a bit more technical, perhaps on compliance issues or on project execution, and that we've in many cases still continue to apply the hourly fee model to that type of service, and that maybe it doesn't fit. And so, I think that we're probably seeing some law firm managements or legal service provider managements that are thinking about their clients, who their clients should be, and how they want to serve them. And I wonder if you might expand a little bit on your previous comments, Melissa, about how they're going to figure this out.
A lot of it is based on data, and a lot of it's data gathering. And, firms rightly complain that they ask for different, they get asked to provide different structures and fees and quotes, and then at the end of the day, after a lot of hard work and hours, the client just comes back and says, well, just give me 10% off your hourly rate. And that's, a symptom of the lack of true discussion and understanding of the business value, because often those arrangements are just repackaged hourly rates, as opposed to, a $500 per hour rate may make sense for a certain type of advisory service, but won't make sense for a document review. And so it's really understanding what the nature of the service is and what the value is to the client in order to figure out how to repackage it. And clients, when I talked earlier about getting their houses in order, I'm helping a lot of company side clients figure out what their data is and figure out what their spend. I mean, there were I know of at least one Canadian chartered bank that when I started my business did not know what their aggregate global legal spend was. never mind Canadian legal spend, because it was disaggregated. So they've made a huge effort to centralize that information so that they can make decisions and find out that they're using firm X for 80% of their business and on one-off bases with weird pricing structures. So a lot of it is visibility and data, which you can now get with the technology that's available. And so understanding the data and understanding the trends and the needs and where things align, and it's often quite surprising for people when they gather the data and put it all together and see where things net out. It's usually a surprise, because on a one-off basis something could seem reasonable. People sign off, it seems reasonable, but when you put it all together and you look at it and you're like, really? That doesn't make sense when you put it all together. And so that's where a lot of clients are spending time and energy figuring that out so they can have an informed discussion. And from the firm's perspective, I strongly encourage the firms that I work with to put aside their profit models, needs, perceptions, and really understand the clients. It's a bit of a leap of faith that the business will follow and that you will be profitable, but in my experience it works out when you put the client's needs and not the firm's profitability first. It works out, and you find ways to adjust your offering and how your resources are being used to provide service, and you get stickier, happier clients. It's a client retention strategy.
So in that, and you've talked to me before about gathering the kind of feedback you need from clients so that you can educate folks internally. But you've also talked to me before about developing T-capable lawyers and plus-capable lawyers. And for some of our audience, that may be a new concept. Yeah. Can you maybe expand on that a bit?
Of course. This is starting, it's really being driven by the business people, and it's being imposed on internal counsel, who then in turn impose it on their external counsel. So there's a trickle-down effect. Traditionally, lawyers have often been silos of legal expertise and excellence, and so they're sort of the I shape. The T shape, which is evolving, is in-house counsel are being asked to do more and be more interrelated with the needs of the business and not just provide isolated legal answers. And so that involves the lawyer developing what we call T-shaped skills, and it's the bar across the top, and it's having some project management experience, some technological expertise and awareness. This doesn't mean being an expert in any of these areas. It just means having enough familiarity to either bring in the necessary resources or guide the resources or provide the necessary context. It's also having financial acumen. So it's understanding and having a business sense. It's understanding enough of the business to know what of the vast amount of legal knowledge you know is relevant to make the particular problem go away, to help drive the strategy of the organization and the success of the organization. What's also evolving, this is where you get to the plus shape, is the little sort of nub on the top, which is emotional intelligence and an EQ awareness, an emotional quotient, because you're dealing with people and understanding what buttons set people off, and understanding how to get people working as teams and bringing people in if you don't have direct control over them, and working together and understanding what would be motivating a sales team to not listen to the legal advice. Like it's understanding all of those factors and how to take the advice, the sound legal analysis, and make it practical and applicable. And that's the plus-shaped package that is being recognized and rewarded and encouraged in today's market.
So perhaps as a corollary to that, as organizations are thinking that stuff through and figuring out how to apply it, Aaron, I wonder if you can talk about, you've been at this a few years less than me, about what the expectations are of sort of the younger, newer participants in the legal service providers, what they expect from their leaders.
So, I mean, I think a lot of younger people, we can use the term millennials, or we can call them whatever you like, some may even be younger, but I think there's an expectation that things will be done in a way that makes sense, using technology where appropriate, using smart processes where appropriate. And I think, a lot of people feel like if they have a solution that makes sense, that the organization, whether it's a law firm or a company, should want to hear it, but also should provide an opportunity for them to provide that information. And I think, companies or firms or what have you who are not listening to the people who are younger or the people at the bottom of the rung. I mean, I think any smart any business that's not listening to, whether it's the cashier at the store or what have you, is missing out on a lot of amazing feedback. And so if you've got an isolated group of decision makers that are all senior and all at the top and may not be involved in the day-to-day, they might be missing out on a lot of opportunities. And it might be that person who's doing that repetitive task at the bottom of the totem pole that might actually have an insight that says, you know what, this actually is really just 3 different tasks. What if we did this, this, and this? We might have an opportunity where it could create a lot more value for us, and it might be something that somebody else doesn't know. So I think it's really just being open-minded and finding a way to get that feedback internally and as we talked about, externally as well.
Well, we're going to talk, we've only got a couple more key slides here to talk through. I do want to invite our guests and our participants today. We received a few questions before, and we've been getting a few as we've been talking, but do want to remind you to use that Q&A box on the side of the presentation if you have any questions you'd like to ask. So, we've listened to our clients. We've thought about what kind of clients we want to serve, how we might serve them. But now we've got to think about how to operationalize all this, whether within a traditional law firm or a law department in a firm. And these are still human capital businesses. And so when I think about the traditional law firm, we've mostly worked with lawyers. Most of what we do is with lawyers. As I said, I've been observing the historical accounting firms for a long time, and I met with the leader of one of the large firms here in Toronto recently, and he said, Randy, less than 2/3 of our professionals are CPAs. Less than 1/3 of our professionals are CPAs. 2/3 of our professionals do all kinds of other things that relate to the business that we operate. And traditional law firms, of course, have used others to help support client service delivery for decades. We rely dramatically, of course, on skilled paralegals. Our marketing departments have been important to us in helping understand which clients we're serving. And, of course, we have significant administrative professionals who've assisted us. But in this new approach of thinking about how to serve clients the best way possible, a large number of other types of professionals, I think, are going to be necessary. And Melissa, we've noted a few here, but I wonder if you can maybe comment on, I know that you work with law firms as well as with clients, on the kinds of other professionals they're considering involving in their operational processes.
Right. As we see on the slide here, you've got everything from pricing specialists to project managers. There's change management. This is a massive change management undertaking. It requires a lot of patience, which, as a lawyer, I can say, we as lawyers typically aren't very well known for our patience, and these are longer-term projects. And so having people with the experience for training, for communication, just because it seems logical to some people who have come up with this is the structure that makes sense, you then, particularly in law firm settings where it's often a collection of individual profit silos, you can't just say this is what's going to happen and it magically happens. The whole change management and buy-in piece is something that, frankly, lawyers don't have a lot of experience with and can use the assistance of people that have that expertise. And so marketing specialists, business development specialists, process engineers, customer experience specialists, all these allied professionals have a value, whether you need someone full-time or part-time or on a consulting basis. Innovation specialists, you now see chief client officers at firms. So there are a range of very valuable inputs and services that allied professionals can provide. And I know from many lawyers that I work with that a lot of them think, well, this is easy, I can do this, it's not intellectually challenging, so I don't see why I have to, pay someone to help me with this. And I can tell you, you can take a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. It's hard to get people to change. And working with people who have experience and expertise and can help with that and can help understand behavior and motivation and getting buy-in is critical.
I think we're also seeing, picking up on what Melissa said there, there's this historical division in a law firm between the lawyer and the non-lawyer. And the lawyers are the profit centers and everyone else is a cost center. And whether it's differences in the way people are treated or salaries, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's going away. Probably not as quickly as it should be, but Melissa was using the term allied professionals, I guess, but one is getting rid of the term non-lawyer, but more importantly than that is recognizing the value that these other people have, and not just the value as support services, but people that should probably be at the table with decision-making authority to some extent, and certainly involved in the key conversations, because they're going to have totally different viewpoints, different skill sets, and if they're just being asked to respond to decisions that have been made by a group of lawyers, you're not going to get the same value out of that than you would have been if you had these people at the table. So I think part of it is also lawyers recognizing what their skill set is, but also what it isn't. And law school trains you to do a few things, and it doesn't train you to do anything else. And I feel like Melissa wants to jump in here.
Well, I love the point that you made about lawyers and firms are the profit generators and everyone else is a cost center. And flipping it to the client's perspective, law as a whole is a cost center. It is not a profit generator. And so it's just interesting to understand you may be the profit generator if you're in a firm within your environment, but from the client's perspective, you are a cost.
Well, and it's interesting, Aaron, when you talk about that, we say on the slide here that these other professionals, allied professionals, I quite like that term, by the way, Melissa, that not all of them may be billers, but most of them affect both positively or negatively profit. And so that one of the key elements, I think, that law firms are going to have to build into their operations is better analytics. Analytics in terms of understanding which kinds of clients could generate the most amount of profit to the firm, so that maybe they do certain things and actually agree not to do certain other things. But also then figuring out from an operational standpoint what's the best way to improve the contribution to the firm or the ultimate bottom line profitability for the firm. I think it's a great segue into our last slide in a minute, but I do want to just highlight for our listeners here today that we talk about other professionals and the role that they have in helping traditional law firms deliver to clients. We're seeing, we talk about others who are part of the process, but we're even starting to see some folks who are leading the entire process that are not lawyers. Just this morning, I received an announcement from Denton's, which obviously is a large international law firm, that in fact their next managing partner in the UK and for the UK and the Middle East is a non-lawyer. We've seen others where you've had chief operating officers who are non-lawyers for law firms, but usually with a lawyer CEO, so to speak. Here, for this one significant element of Denton's international law practice, they've actually hired somebody from the Royal Bank of Scotland to become their next leader. So I think we may see a bit more of that in the years to come.
And I think that shows really that law has always been a business, but it's finally starting to be run more like a business. And when you look at would you choose a group of 10 lawyers to lead your non-law business, the answer is generally no. And I think you start applying a lot of these skills and learnings from other industries. They're equally applicable to law, especially amongst other professional services businesses. But I mean, looking at the way services are delivered often requires an outside perspective.
Right. So I'm going to move on to our last slide here. And so we now understand what our clients want, what our resources are to serve them, what some of the strategies we might employ to serve them, what are some of the operational approaches and personnel we need. But then a lot of this will ultimately sift down to certain types of processes and technologies we might use. And I know, Aaron, here at our firm, you spend a lot of time on this, and I know, Melissa, you do as well with your clients. And I wonder if you might, in the next 5 or 6 minutes, sort of help us understand some of the things that are being done today, because there's a lot of it, what we think is going to come pretty soon, and then maybe some things that we're hearing words about, but really might be a few years away.
So I think the first thing is that people often see technology as this magic savior. And I think if you view it that way, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble pretty quickly, because you firstly may not understand the problem you're trying to solve, and you also might be building a solution that really isn't going to address that. So I think the first thing to think about is, you've got the people, you've got the process, and you've got the technology. And at the end of the day, what you need to do is try to figure out what problem are you trying to solve. So if it's in-house, for example, it might be you're looking at your billing, and you might say, look, really what I want to do is I've got a list of 15 law firms I'm working with currently, and I want to get that list down to 3 and extract better value out of each of them. And what technological solutions are there out there to do that, so I can gather better data. But if you're just simply technology for the sake of technology, it's not getting you that far. I think what a lot of lawyers aren't trained on, or almost none are trained on, is really thinking about the process. The task is to do X. How do I go about doing that? How often am I asked to do that? And what are the ways where I could look and find some efficiencies, whether you're an in-house lawyer who's probably overwhelmed with work, and that's part of the reason you're outsourcing work in the first place, or you've got, you're trying to do more with less, which is the case, or you're an outside legal provider who is getting pressure from clients. You may not need technology to fix it. It might simply be a better way of organizing data or something along those lines. If you're looking to use technology, there's a number of interesting areas where the technology is out there. One example, for example, is in the due diligence space. So on large M&A transactions, there often are voluminous amounts of contracts to go through. So an example of one that we're using is called Diligent, and it's using machine learning technology to augment the lawyer, not to replace the lawyer. This is not the end of lawyers, which I think a lot of people might think, oh, technology is going to be the end, and it's far from it. But it's providing a more efficient way to do something. And I think the example you can use is, if you go to your doctor because you're sick, and the doctor says, I can read, it's your radiologist, for example, and they say, look, I can read this thing on my own, I've got a lot of experience, but we've also got this thing that's been built, and it's got a pretty good rate. At no cost to you, would you want me to use both? Or do you want to just rely on my years of experience and what I've seen historically? And as a patient, you're probably going to want them to use both because, if the doctor misses something, you'd probably hope and the technology catches it, that might save your life. So it's about the augmentation of the technology, but it's all over the map. There's some interesting software out there on the legal research side. So an example of a company would be a Blue Jay Legal example, so helping in the tax space or the employment space. And it's one that can help you find cases more quickly, but also help you understand probabilities. So when we talk about cost-benefit here, what we're saying is, here's some data based on more cases than that lawyer has seen on their own that may help determine or provide some insight into whether or not you're likely to win that case. Is it a guarantee of that? Absolutely not, but it might provide more data to, again, augment the lawyer's personal experience and understanding. In-house, if you're doing contract review, there's some interesting technology out there like a LawGeeks or a Legal Sifter or even a Diligent and other providers like that, where you might say, my business team keeps asking me to do these type of reviews. There's a lot of things that I don't care about, and there's a few things I care about. So here's the playbook, and allow the business team to do more of the work that's traditionally seen as legal, but allow you to flag certain things that legal needs to review if they deviate from that standard. So that's an example, though, where first you need to figure out what that playbook looks like, and only then would you say, is there a technology solution you want to use? And Melissa, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. It's technology is not a silver bullet, and people think that they can just apply it and make things go away. Technology is just another form of employee. It doesn't need bathroom breaks and lunch breaks, but it needs training, it needs updates, it needs care and feeding, and it needs onboarding. So technology can only reflect what you already know. It can't magically fix the unknown. So you need to know what your process is and what you're trying to accomplish in order to figure out what technology is available that supports that.
I think one thing, there's a lot of talk about AI, obviously, and I alluded to that, and is it going to replace lawyers and all that? And I think AI is at the nascent stage in the legal side. There is a couple areas where right now it's a lot more powerful. One of those is definitely on the due diligence side, for example. But certainly, as we see technology in general evolving, it's only a matter of time until we see it in more and more products to the point where no one's even talking about AI, because at the end of the day, it's really just what is this solution able to offer, and whether it's leveraging AI or not really doesn't matter to the customer. I think we're in the very early days, though, of adoption. Firms are starting to use this. In-house companies or companies may be starting to use this, depending on the client needs. But certainly, it's the early stages right now, and I think if you look at where we were compared to 5 years ago, night and day difference, but this is the beginning of the journey. And I think also a lot of this, when we talk about legal innovation and we really take a step back and say, well, what is innovation? Innovation to a legal services business may not be innovation outside of that. Law firms and companies, legal departments were starting from a pretty low point. So when we say, legal project management is innovation, we're just taking things and applying them from outside the legal business to the legal business.
So one of the things, Aaron, that obviously managements of traditional legal providers are going to have to think about is as they adopt technology, because I can see why a client says, hey, if I can do something that's going to allow me to review, I'm 7-Eleven, I want to review those 10,000 contracts, and Diligent or any other kind of contract review software can help me do that, that's great. If, as you said, Melissa, to many clients, all legal costs are an expense. They're not a profit-generating matter. But for law firms that might adopt that technology, in a way, many management of law firms probably think it's eating their own lunch. And so I don't know if you've been having any conversations, Melissa, with your law firm clients as to how they're going to ultimately reprice based on the fact that they might have reduced some of the hours that younger lawyers or others have used to review 1,000 contracts by using some kind of software capability. Have they given you some thoughts on how they're going to reprice for that?
Well, it's interesting. With one firm that I did a review of a vertical of their business and pointed out a chunk, about 25% of the revenue in that area was screaming for fixed fee. And the initial reaction of the management was, well, we're not really set up for that, so we'll outsource that. As a business person, you'd think that's a recurring 25% of revenue year over year. Just figure out how to deliver that using your existing resources differently. And so it's looking at people will still be needed. They'll be needed in different roles. So it's figuring out how to redeploy and how to price, and then use those resources. So you now have associates that have more time because they aren't doing the contract review. They're doing some analysis. Teach them business development. Teach them, have them help figure out the processes. Help invest in the growth and the identification of other opportunities.
Great. Aaron, I have one question for you. We see it in a few of the questions we've got today, and we also we see it generally. Everybody presumes, that blockchain and smart contracts are just going to rid us of the lawyers. Shakespeare might like that, I suppose. But we've noted it here as it's a bit down the road. Do you have an observation or a thought about that?
Yeah, I think blockchain or distributed ledger technology more broadly has massive applications. But that's, again, very much at the nascent stage. There's lots of people doing pilots and exploring ways to use it, often in business cases, and there are certainly applications in the legal space, but we're certainly in the early days of that. I think in general, the real takeaway is things are changing. There are alternative ways of doing things. Blockchain is a good example of ways where certain services that lawyers or any intermediary, including a bank or anything like that, that they typically performed may no longer be needed as much. And again, anytime you're in a client service business, you need to figure out a way to meet the needs of your clients. So if you no longer add value to them, then you're not going to be providing services. And so in the areas where you look and you say, well, the client clearly needs help, it's really about how do you deliver that value. And I think with some of the questions here, I think one of the things that's challenging in this space is where to start. I want to start learning more about what products are out there, understanding the industry better. So I've got a couple examples that I would recommend. So some people might be into podcasts. There are a number of great podcasts out there. One of the ones I particularly like is called Building New Law. It's by the folks at Countertax in Toronto. Fantastic job interviewing a lot of leading people in this space. If you're in-house or even at a firm, there are a number of organizations you can join. There's one called ILTA, I-L-T-A. There's CLOC, C-L-O-C. That's on the operational side. In terms of reading online, so I publish a weekly newsletter. I post it on LinkedIn, but I also post it on our internal blog called thespotlight.ca. There's also a number of sites. Artificial Lawyer is a particular good one, a good way to sort of get a sense of a lot of information that's happening in the space. And if you're in-house and you're thinking, what are all these kind of technologies I could adopt? Forget the process for a second, but what are the technologies that are out there? There's a report from a company called Law Geeks, L-A-W-G-E-E-X, that has a really great summary of different areas of technology that's out there, and that might be a good starting point to get a sense of, wow, I had no idea this existed. Let me at least start by researching these.
Great. So we pretty much come to the end of our presentation. We have received more than a few questions. I think we've answered some of them along the way. But for those that we haven't been able to, just to remind the folks here on the line, we will be following up with all participants and all registrants, and we'll do our very best to answer the questions that we didn't answer during our presentation in our follow-up. I wonder if, and of course, you'll see at the end of the presentation that there's an opportunity to contact any one of us. All of our contact information will be there. I wondered if, Melissa, you wanted to share any final thought before we wrap up.
I guess just one final thought, the best place to start, and some people are asking, it can be a mindset change, it can be a data, is just understanding what the gap is. And what I mean there is figure out where you are and how that compares to where you need to be, and then you work from there of identifying how best to address that. So, maybe where you are and where you need to be has a huge gap and a lot of different opportunities. So figure out what the ones are that are going to have the biggest impact and the lowest hanging fruit, particularly if you're trying to get buy-in and generate help. You need success stories, and you need to start little. Do not start with a major overhaul. Those are really hard. Those are big projects. Start little with pilot tests and testing things out. Failure is part of this process, and that's not something lawyers are comfortable with, and you've got to embrace the failure because it will not be perfect day one. In fact, it will never be perfect because you're evolving as your clients are evolving, as the market is evolving. So this is an ongoing journey, and you have to be constantly reevaluating and addressing, and look for the gaps, start small, and keep at it.
Very good. Well, as it says here on our last slide, and as you heard earlier and over the course of this last hour, there's a lot going on, but there's very few people who could be said to be really at the front end of this curve. It is a journey. You do need to get buy-in. You do need to analyze your own organization. You have to become ready culturally to accept and embrace innovation. But as they often say about trees, the best time ever to have planted a tree was 30 years ago, but the second best time to plant a tree is today. And if we can offer one last thought here is if you think you're behind on legal innovation, today is a great time to start. So on behalf of Melissa LaFlair and Aird Baer, I just want to thank you for participating here with us for an hour. All of our contact information is up on the screen. Please contact any one of us if you have anything specific you'd like to ask. As well, for all of the questions that we weren't able to address during our presentation, we will be sending out the slides and they will be archived, and we'll do our very best to answer them specifically so that all of you can see what others on the call have asked us about. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.